I want to ask you a question. Do you think it's possible to help heal the trauma of those who are not yet born? I believe it is. Yet, in order to help heal the trauma of those who are not yet born, we need to do the work to heal our own trauma within in a way that works best for us. Now, my healing journey began at a farm decades ago. My therapists were cows, pigs, sheep, and a cornfield. Today, this same farm serves as base for a children's grief camp, created to help those who live with trauma. My story is how I transformed trauma and shame into healthy actions, and how you can too. I grew up surrounded by addiction, and I am talking both sides, multi-generational alcoholism. Parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. It wasn't uncommon for relatives, including my own brother, to die from alcoholism before the age of 50. Now, my bet is that if you grew up surrounded by addiction, you know the chaos, angst, shame, secrecy, and pain, the emotional and the mental isolation. I didn't want what few friends I had coming over my house. The atmosphere was heavy and humiliating, and holidays were often dreadful. As a child, I came face to face with Satan. Now, growing up in the 60s and 70s, one didn't talk about what happened around or in the home. The physical, mental, or sexual abuse never happened, or it wasn't as bad as you think it was. And when I was believed, I was met with crippling accusations of, well, how are you acting to make him treat you like that? How was I acting? I guess I was acting like a 9-year-old, because that's what I was, 9. And I'll never forget, Satan had hollow, yellow, lifeless eyes and stomach-churning breath. Now, because of dark secrets, I thought all the other kids had perfect families and lives. All the other kids fell asleep feeling safe, and adults protected them. And because all the other kids had such perfect lives, the problems at home had to have been because of me. And for years, I carried shame, blame, and self-loathing, like another child would carry her favorite teddy bear, a blanket, and eventually a Coach purse. Trust and attachment was just something I couldn't grasp. I started having panic attacks when I was in middle school. By the time I was in 9th grade, I was in treatment for anxiety. The world was dangerous and it was filled with tricks. And I made decisions well into adulthood based on fear, self-preservation, and survival. I would have done anything to feel loved and protected and accepted. And in fact, I did. And I was often reminded that making decisions based on such drivers was neither healthy or sustainable. So through the dark dungeon thinking, always finding crushing fault within myself, I managed to remember a time during my childhood that was the calm eye of a wicked storm. I did graduate from high school second in my class, and then I took the scenic route to get my bachelor's, master's, and then further studies at Penn Vet to study animal behavior and animal welfare. I tried marriage twice. While getting dressed for the engagement party of my first marriage, my father died. He went upstairs, he put on his suit, he sat down on the bed, and he died. My dad was 61. Through all of this as an adult, I could remember there were times during my childhood that was the calm eye of a wicked storm. Looking back, this calm was made possible through a long journey of self-initiated animal and nature and animal-assisted therapy. It began when I was in grade school. A friend of mine introduced me to a magical place behind her home. It was a farm. And for years, my friend and I would run and play in these grand rolling cow pastures. We would play in the stream. We would visit with the cows and the sheep and the pigs. We played inside this most magnificent greenhouse, and there were loads and loads of daffodils lining the pastures in the spring. Now, when I was at this farm, I felt free, protected, and accepted. More than a place, this farm became an imprinting, a feeling, and a part of my soul. I visited this farm as often as I could well into my adulthood. Decades later, I was given the chance to work at my childhood haven. From somewhere out of the heavens, my life came full circle and in a most incredible way. I was home, and this time it was good. The farm I speak of today is Hillside Farms. It's located in Trucksville, Pennsylvania. Now, Hillside Farms traces its roots back to 1881. In 2005, it became a nonprofit educational dairy farm. Actually, Hillside Farms is a 412-acre outdoor classroom. And here, kids and students come to learn about math and biology, history, agriculture, animal husbandry, as well as healthier ways of living. Now, my primary role at this farm is development and marketing. And it is by far the most fulfilling work ever, especially because of Children's Grief Camp. A few years back, an unexpected aha moment came that catapulted me to where I'm standing today. I reconnected with someone who I'd gone to school with. While chatting over lunch, she shared with me a few details about her pending divorce. Her soon-to-be ex-husband, who I'd also gone to school with, was an alcoholic. His father was an alcoholic, and he had relatives who were addicts. Everything stopped. Now, I'm listening to her, but simultaneously thinking to myself, wait a second, this was one of the perfect families. This was one of the families where everybody was lined up in the pew at church, praying and singing in unison. And you mean to tell me he had lived through a similar hell? If only I had known. If only I had known as a child, then maybe I wouldn't have seen myself as such a freak. And then I got to thinking, if he had gone through this private tour of living hell, there had to be others. There must be other adults in my circle who still hide scars from childhood trauma. That moment was cathartic. So I began to think, and before too long, I had an idea. Drawing on my personal experiences growing up, I wanted to find a way where Hillside Farms, my childhood haven, could help other children who were hurting. Find something so they too could feel welcomed, understood, and accepted. And this something would be a one-week summer camp for grieving children. But I thought, this can't be a sad and heavy camp. This needs to be a camp for the kiddos, yet something that's going to allow the children, if they wanted to share their feelings and talk about their stuff. Every child at this camp would be going through stuff. So, we have this dairy farm, which means we have cows, and we have other farm critters too, and we also have sprawling pastures, we have streams, we have woods, check, check, check. Missing was a critical piece. How can we help children understand the grief process, the ebb and flow of the grief process, and that you could even be happy during grief? How could we help children understand and believe that they're not alone? I reached out to a local hospice who agreed to provide grief education professionals for that week. This was the missing piece, and we were on our way. In 2014, we launched our first farm-based children's grief camp, a one-week trial to kind of test the need. Now, Children's Grief Camp is a free camp that is open to children ages 6 through 14 and all who have experienced grief. It combines animal-assisted activities, animal-assisted therapies, grief education, and grief sessions. All children at this camp have experienced serious stuff. Some have lost a family member due to accident, illness, murder, or suicide. We have children coming to this camp who found a parent dead from a drug overdose. We have children who are in foster care due to neglect and abuse. We have children who have parents in prison. Now, while at camp, kids do a variety of activities with the animals. They clean the stalls, they groom the animals, they feed and water the animals, they exercise the animals. They also spend quiet time with the animals. The animals all have names, and they respond so well to talk and touch. They also learned that some of the animals have special needs: separation anxiety, some were bullied, many were abandoned, and some were taken away from their parents. A farm favorite activity during children's grief camp is reading books to the animals. Now, during this camp, there were grief education sessions and emotional support activities tailored to the children's individual needs. Now, the idea here is to have the children be comfortable with whatever they're feeling, understanding that what they're experiencing is not their fault. They didn't bring it on, and they certainly do not need to fix it. The kids also learn that there are appropriate ways to communicate really complex feelings related to their specific circumstances. Now, these grief education activities are encouraged, but they're not required. Children have the freedom and the acceptance to sit within their own comfort levels. Yet, the majority of the kids basically open up and they begin to share. There was one camper who had lost her mother a few weeks before coming to camp, and she was not going to talk about anything about her loss. 3 days into grief camp, while bottle feeding a calf, this youngster begins to talk about how on her way to visit her mom in the hospital, she would pass farms. And on the farms, there were cows. You see, bottle feeding that calf created a connection for her, a special, safe place for her to start to share. During camp during another week, a 6-year-old camper at lunch looks around at her fellow campers and she says, "Don't even get me started on my mother's old boyfriend. He came home drunk every night. My mom got sick of him and she threw him out." 6 years old. During another week, a teenage boy in foster care shared with me that he recognized someone in camp. They had gone to school together. "I was embarrassed to have her see me here," he said. But then I thought, her heart was probably hurting too. At the end of the week, camp wraps up with an incredible special ceremony. Children write a note, and this note can be to anyone, and they plant it in the children's memory garden. On top of the note, they plant a flower. And when all the children are finished planting their notes and their flowers, we gather around this children's memory garden and we share a poem. We talk about growing through grief, metamorphosis, followed by a butterfly release. There are hugs and tears and laughter and high fives. Kids use thick black permanent markers to sign each other's camp t-shirts. And we encourage every single child to return to this garden, for this garden and this farm is their special safe place. Grief Camp has now grown to 3 weeks, and it is recognized in numerous publications and at national grief conferences. Grief Camp is also an incredible collaboration of community, including our child welfare agencies and our court system. A nationally recognized food justice advocate spearheads pop-up produce stands so children have access to fresh, healthy meals. Occupational therapy graduate students from a local university create and facilitate grief-related activities. Trauma counselors volunteer time. Social workers volunteer time. Chefs come on board now to teach these children how to make quick, delicious, healthy meals. And our farm-based children's grief camp shows promise that it is working. Evidence-based outcomes support our theories. Now, data is collected in the form of pre- and post surveys, journaling, observations, and interviews. Now, the idea here is to have the kids go through a process of improvement and progress. But I think what's most telling is the number of kids who want to return to camp to be peer counselors in training. You know, often we think about the term sustainability as it relates to an environment: air, soil, water, recycling. Yet, if we do not focus on our most valuable and vulnerable asset, our children, what good is the rest? What good is providing resources that surround us when inside the collective we are hurting? Sustainability as a society is a collection of key variables, and children need to be a priority. All children, regardless of circumstances and abilities, have value, they matter, and they belong. They are not a burden, and our kids need to hear that. Now, I am not expecting my story to have everybody run out and start a grief camp for children. My drive for sharing is to have others here recognize their trauma for not only a way to help heal themselves, but to perhaps help others, especially children. At Children's Grief Camp, we have guest speakers. Adults come to speak to these kids at camp, and many of these adults are community leaders. They speak about being in foster care, being homeless, being suicidal, overcoming extreme challenges mentally, physically, and emotionally. They also talk about drug abuse, growing up surrounded by addiction. There was a little boy, after someone spoke about addiction in his family, he was 7 years old, and he raised his hand and he said, "My father does drugs, and he gave away my baby sister." And he started to cry. And immediately, all the children came around to hug and comfort him. What if only 1, 5, or 10 of you had something click inside so you too would transform trauma into action? Step into the trenches with just one child. Share your story with a child hit with trauma. Let them know that they can and they will get through this. You did it, and they will too. And one day, that child, now an adult, will share her story with another hurting child. Could you imagine the ripple effect? You have the power to help heal future generations. Think about that. You have the power to help heal future generations. Transformation through trauma and shame is tough, painful, messy, and even terrifying. I know it is. Yet it is critical in order to move us individually and collectively toward a happier, healthier, more sustainable self and a more sustainable society. You see, I believe the term unconditional love is redundant. True love, including self-love, has no conditions, and our children need to hear this. And while it's tragic that a 9-year-old me locked eyes with Satan, in the end, Satan blinked first. And I say this because my transformation through trauma and shame became the building blocks for a program where nature and farm animals help children see their precious value and to understand that life can and will get better. That life is not solely what happens to you, but rather what you do with what happens to you. Thank you.